Hey everybody, Hoosier Jedi here again with another review for you. This time I'm going to be talking about episode 7 of Ultimate Spider-Man called Exclusive. Overall, I think this is a reasonably solid episode. Actually, I'd even give it the rating of slightly above average, but there are still some quibbles that I have with this episode, but there were also some things that I did like a pretty good amount. So let's get right into it. This is more or less the Mary Jane episode of the series so far, where we get to spend a little bit of time with her and see things from her point of view, more or less. And while it is done well, uh, I'm just I'm just still not happy with the whole thing of them basically turning Mary Jane into Lois Lane or slash Chloe Sullivan from Smallville. It's just such a radical departure for her character. And again, it's something we've seen, the whole girl reporter deal. We've seen it done in so many other places, and it just feels out of place character wise for Mary Jane. But that said, even though I think they're going in a rather cliche direction, I think they are making at least a reasonably good effort to try and tell a story I've seen more than once, quite a few times really, in a way that's at least interesting and entertaining. So I will give them credit. They're doing an all right job on that point. But let's get right into things. Our special guest star this episode is none other than the Incredible Hulk himself. We're getting a slightly more humorous take on the Hulk than we have been getting in the comics in recent years. I don't really mind that all that much. The Hulk certainly does get that wonderful line about Hulk hate paparazzi and Hulk doesn't do interviews, and that those certainly did make for a nice chuckle here and there. And I have to give a great deal of credit to the fellow that they have playing the Hulk in this episode. Hang on, his name's a bit of a mouthful. I had to write it down. His name is Fred Tatasciore. Wow. Yeah. Anyway, he, from what I've been able to find out, has voiced the Hulk on the Avengers cartoon. He's appeared as the voice of the Hulk in a few of the more recent Marvel video games. He was Saren in Mass Effect. And amazingly enough, he was also the English voice for Beast in the X-Men anime. So, a guy with no small amount of voice acting and Marvel experience under his belt. I do definitely appreciate that in anybody that they cast in the show. And speaking of which, naturally, even though I have quibbles with what they're doing with her character and story-wise, I certainly can't find absolutely no fault whatsoever in Tara Strong's performance as Mary Jane. And Logan Bell, I believe is his first name, Logan, is certainly doing a fine. He's much improved as Peter Parker. It's been a while since I've commented on that, and I definitely think he's earned some props for that. But anyway, let's move on to, since I was just talking about Mary Jane, let's talk about one of the problems that I do have with this episode. And they're basically doing this in the style of one of those found footage movies like The Blair Witch Project or Cloverfield or more recently Chronicle. And while there certainly is nothing wrong with that, it's an interesting, very modern way of telling a story. The problem with this sort of thing, and if you pay attention to their reviews, the guys at Red Letter Media pointed this out very nicely in their review of Chronicle, that when you're doing this, it just seems extremely, if not at times flat out impossible, for the camera to be pointing at things from that angle, or that the camera would, honestly, after everything he's been through, still even be intact. Mary Jane must have bought the most shock-proof camera known to man. Probably some very excellent Japanese craftsmanship at work there. But anyway, so I definitely did have that in the back of my mind while I was watching this episode. And speaking of which, one touch that I did like is that if you're paying attention through most of the episode, you can slowly see the battery from the camera dying down. And by the time it gets to the fight in the subway, it's at what I would say is less than a quarter of a charge. And then somehow mysteriously during all of that, it jumps right back up to being pretty much full. Now, I guess you could say that it somehow picked up a charge from Zax. That's the name of the electricity monster, incidentally. If you didn't, if you're not familiar with the comics, he's he's a reoccurring foe of the Hulk, and they even sort of name checked him when the Hulk says Hulk hate getting zaxed instead of zapped. But so just throwing that out there for the folks who aren't familiar with the comics, and I will give them credit. Even if you are a reader of the comics, Zax is certainly not the most prominent villain in the Marvel universe. But anyway, as I was saying, the camera charge jumps from being almost empty to being pretty much full again, and you can sort of see the whole thing, that it was going to be Mary Jane's camera battery that was going to be the straw that broke the camel's back, and then she was going to have that moment where she's like, I don't want to do this, but I have to do it to save the city. And while predictable is certainly not necessarily bad in storytelling, as long as you deliver a solid enough story, the audience can easily forgive being able to guess the twists and turns. And while I do think this is a reasonably solid story, I have to say that in order for me to be able to forgive seeing stuff that far down the horizon, the story was going to would have needed to be a lot stronger than it really was. So, it's very much an almost but not quite on that one. So I'm just not entirely happy with the writing there. So anyway, let's keep going. One thing that I do definitely have to take issue with is that the idea that night vision can let you see invisible energy monsters. Okay, look, I'm not going to claim to be an expert on military tech or anything like that, but I'm pretty sure if you were to switch on night vision stuff during the middle of the day, you'd probably about half blind yourself. And wait a minute, Peter has night vision built into all of his masks? Where the heck is he getting the stuff to do this? I mean, look, I can get that a biochemistry genius like Peter can create this insanely awesome webbing out of stuff that a miner can apparently get from a chemistry store. But he can also build his own night vision goggles and do it enough that he can put it in all of his masks. It is, you know what, I feel a little ridiculous saying, is that realistic? But I'm sorry, that's the question that's in my mind. So I have to put it out there. If you've never heard of it, there's this thing called Belisario's Maxim. And it's named after Donald P. Belisario, who most of you guys, and if that name sounds familiar, he's the creator of shows like NCIS and was it JAG and Quantum Leap, and quite a few other shows. Oh yes, including Airwolf. Yes, the esteemed 1980 show Airwolf. And it basically goes, do not examine this too carefully. And it's very similar to the old MST3K motto of repeat to yourself, it's just a show, I should really just relax. And while I can appreciate the wisdom of that, sometimes I think that TV and movies just ask a little too much of me in that regard, and this is certainly one of them. So anyway, and the sad thing is, though, just a few minutes later on, they make some, as far as I understand it, very accurate comments about the nature of how electricity works. So it just sort of feels like the writers were being a little too choosy by where they decided to say, hey, we've done our homework on this sort of thing. But exactly how much hard science, or do any of us really expect in a show about a guy who got superhuman powers after being bitten by a radioactive spider? But anyway, one thing that I do have to give them credit for doing that I liked was when things really start getting hairy, Spider-Man goes and he calls in Shield, which realistically, yeah, that's what he certainly should have done. And they show up and they do acknowledge that okay, Shield are out dealing with something else, which is why they weren't on scene immediately. These are questions that are going to come into the minds of the audience, and I do have to give the show credit for dealing with that. And of course, we also got to have Nick Fury show up and kind of get his character moments, his interaction with Spider-Man, so we can sort of see a little bit more of the dynamic between them, which I liked. But okay, so where are the Amazing Friends at? That is what I want to know. I mean, Shield has the excuse that they were off fighting a monster. Well, okay, why weren't the rest of the team helping them fight the monster? Heck, why didn't they call Spider-Man to help them fight the monster? I mean, I don't know where exactly in New Jersey this thing was, but New Jersey's not that big a state, and Shield has all this supersonic aircraft. They certainly could have gotten Spider-Man there in virtually no time at all. So again, where were these guys? Were they at home doing homework, or making stupid, idiotic arguments on the Star Wars The Old Republic forums? What? But again, Belisario's maxim: do not examine this too closely. And frankly, I will give this to the writers. If they had brought in the Amazing Friends, that would have just been too many people to juggle. This episode is essentially about Mary Jane, Spider-Man, and the Hulk. And bringing them in really would have just been more, scratching continuity issues off the wall instead of doing what really made for the best story. And speaking of making for the best story, one thing that I will grant this episode that got a lot of points from me was the part where the Hulk, calls Spider-Man Bugman, and Spider-Man goes, "Spiders are not bugs." If you read the comics, one thing that that Spider-Man does a lot is whenever somebody says, I'm going to squash you like a bug or blah blah blah. Anytime any villain or anybody throws the word bug at Spider-Man, he will almost always point out that spiders are not bugs; they are arachnids. And while science was never my best subject, I do remember this from school. The difference between an insect and an arachnid is that insects traditionally have 6 legs, while arachnids have 8. So you see, you learn things from my videos, and not just that English stuff, science class too. Yeah. All right, so let me see what else. Well, that's really about all that I had for this episode. So again, as I said, overall, this is a solid to slightly above average episode, mostly boosted by a pretty strong appearance, very entertaining appearance by the Hulk, but just some plot holes really bring this episode down for me. But still, I will give the show credit. I do think that it's slowly but steadily been improving as this season has been wearing on. So if the show can keep this pace up, I think that it has a real future in store. Anyway, folks, that's all I have to say. As always, please comment, rate, and subscribe. As I've said before, you can also follow me on Twitter as Hoosier Jedi. Until next time, everybody, take care and have a good one.